My name is Alexandra Reed. I've been a federal police officer for 12 years, currently serving in the Transportation Security Division at Boston Logan International Airport. Many call me Alex, others just Reed. Some don't address me at all. They just look at me with that mix of distrust and relief people often reserve for authority figures in uncertain times. I grew up in suburban Maine, the daughter of a naval mechanic and a nurse. My grandfather, Thomas Reed, was one of Portland's most decorated police officers during the 1980s and 1990s. He taught me about duty and service. He also taught me that following the rules doesn't always mean doing the right thing. But I wouldn't fully understand that until years later. That April morning, the sky over Boston was clear. The kind of clarity that's deceptive, promising warmth, when in reality, the biting Atlantic wind still carried the last breath of winter. I was in the middle of my shift, which had started at 4:30 a.m. I'd already inspected 3 domestic flights and 1 international flight, checked credentials of dozens of employees, and dealt with 2 passengers who'd forgotten water bottles in their carry-on bags. Routine. The briefing for Trans-American Airlines Flight 3715 to Chicago should have been equally routine. A normal domestic flight, with no security alerts, no important figures, nothing requiring special attention, except for my grandfather's presence. Thomas Reed, 82, retired for nearly 2 decades, still maintained the firm bearing and discerning gaze that intimidated suspects and inspired respect among colleagues. He was traveling to Chicago for my cousin's wedding and insisted on stopping by my station to say goodbye. "Alexandra," he said, watching as I coordinated the security team for boarding, "you're overreacting. It's just a regular commercial flight. Relax a little." I smiled, not taking my eyes off the monitor showing the luggage x-rays. "Standard procedure, Grandpa. You, of all people, should understand." He snorted, that characteristic sound that indicated disapproval without necessarily direct confrontation. In my day, we trusted instincts more, and these devices less. You're so focused on these monitors that you're not seeing what really matters. I shot him a quick glance, trying to hide my irritation. I loved my grandfather, but I hated it when he took on that condescending tone, as if modern policing were somehow inferior to what he practiced decades ago. "What would that really matter, Grandpa?" I asked, as I signaled for one of the agents to check a suspicious bag. "People, Alex. Always people." He discreetly pointed to a man in the boarding line. Tall, thin, seemingly in his 40s, dressed in a well-cut suit that was slightly too large for his frame. He held a black leather briefcase in both hands, as if it contained something valuable. "What's wrong with him? Look at his hands, trembling. Look at his forehead, sweat, even though it's cold." And he doesn't take his eyes off that boarding gate as if he's counting the seconds. I watched the man discreetly. My grandfather was right. He was showing clear signs of nervousness. But that wasn't uncommon in airports. A lot of people get nervous before flying, Grandpa. It doesn't mean anything. Maybe. Or maybe it means everything. The priority boarding announcement blared over the loudspeakers. My grandfather adjusted the strap of his backpack, having always refused to use wheeled suitcases, which he considered touristy, and kissed me on the cheek. "I have to go. Remember what I taught you. Trust your instincts." I nodded, more to end the conversation than to agree. As he walked away, I saw him pause briefly next to the man in the suit, who was now further ahead in the line. My grandfather said something. The man responded quickly without looking at him, and my grandfather continued to the gate. 5 minutes later, my radio crackled. "Reed, we need you at gate 17. Possible problem with the boarding bridge." "On my way," I replied, already on the move. When I arrived at the gate, I found a small crowd of passengers gathering around the entrance to the boarding bridge. The problem was immediately apparent. The movable bridge connecting the terminal to the aircraft had jammed midway, leaving a gap of approximately 2 meters between the door and the plane's entrance. The gate attendant tried to calm the passengers while frantically talking on the phone, probably with maintenance. I spotted my grandfather, standing near the window, watching the scene with an expression I knew well that I knew something was going to happen. "Look, what's wrong?" I asked the attendant, showing my badge. "Mechanical problem with the bridge. Maintenance is on its way, but it will take at least 20 minutes. The pilot is concerned about the departure time. We are trying to organize a mobile ladder for boarding via the runway." At that moment, I noticed a sudden movement. The man in the suit, my grandfather had pointed out was trying to get past the attendant, heading toward the faulty bridge. "Sir, please, boarding is temporarily suspended." The attendant tried to stop him. "I need to board now," he insisted, his voice thick with an accent I couldn't immediately place. "I have an important connection in Chicago." "Everyone will be accommodated, sir. Please wait." The situation escalated quickly. The man pushed the attendant aside and ran toward the faulty bridge. I immediately stepped forward, placing myself between him and the entrance. "Federal police, stop immediately." He hesitated for a moment, looking from me to the bridge, then to his briefcase. It was in that fleeting moment that I realized my grandfather was right. This wasn't the usual nervousness of a late traveler. Final warning: step back and put your hands where I can see them. Instead, he dropped the briefcase and tried to push me away. Training took over in one motion. I pinned his right arm and forced him against the wall, pushing him away from the now shocked crowd. "Everyone back!" I shouted, holding the man still. "Get away from the gate!" Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my grandfather approach the abandoned bridge. Before I could yell at him to move away, he was already kneeling beside it. "Grandpa, don't touch that." Completely ignoring me, he carefully opened the folder. His expression changed immediately. "Alex!" he called, his voice too calm for the situation. "Evacuation." Now, I pressed my radio as I held the suspect down. Code red at gate 17, possible threat. Requesting immediate evacuation and bomb disposal team. The response was immediate. Evacuation alarms blared throughout the terminal. Reinforcements arrived within seconds, taking control of the suspect while I coordinated the evacuation of the passenger. Amidst the chaos, I searched for my grandfather and found him still near the briefcase, now talking to one of the bomb disposal officers who had arrived. Hours later in the interrogation room, the picture became Ashraf Khalid, an American citizen of Iraqi origin, planned to blow up the plane in retaliation for American bombings in the Middle East. The briefcase contained a bomb sophisticated enough to bring down the aircraft, programmed to detonate when it reached a certain altitude. What saved hundreds of lives that day wasn't the airport's advanced technology or meticulously planned security protocols. It was the instinct of an 82-year-old retired police officer who noticed something amiss in a passenger's behavior. When I finally had a moment alone with my grandfather in the airport cafeteria, hours after the incident, he seemed strangely calm, sipping his coffee as if we had just witnessed a passing shower, not an attempted terrorist attack. "How did you know?" I asked finally. He shrugged. That characteristic gesture that indicated the answer was obvious. "He wasn't nervous about the flight, Alex. He was nervous. Because the bridge broke." "What? What do you mean?" "When the bridge got stuck, everyone was angry, frustrated." He was relieved, then nervous, as if the original plan had been changed and he had to improvise. I remained silent, absorbing the information. "What about the bomb? How did you know it was in the briefcase?" My grandfather smiled, that smile of someone keeping a secret. "I didn't know for sure. But he held that briefcase like a baby. He never put it down, even when he had to present documents, until, in a moment of panic, he abandoned it to try to run away." I nodded, impressed. "When you told me to stand down at the briefing... I wasn't being arrogant, Alex. I was trying to warn you. You were so focused on the proceedings that you weren't seeing what really mattered. People," I finished, remembering his words. "Always the people," he confirmed. "That's the first lesson every police officer should learn." That night, as I filed incident reports, I reflected on how I'd almost ignored my grandfather's instincts by relying too heavily on technology and protocols. How I'd almost allowed a tragedy to happen because I'd been too busy following the rules. It was the first of many lessons I would learn in the years to come. Lessons about balancing procedure and instinct between technology and humanity. About how, sometimes, you need to take a step back to see the bigger picture. And most importantly, about how we should always listen to our elders, especially when they say, "Stand down." The months following the Boston airport incident were intense. I underwent countless interviews, meetings with superiors, and debriefing sessions with the FBI and CIA. The Ashraf Khalid case became a case study in training manuals for airport security officers across the country. I received a medal for bravery, which I reluctantly accepted. After all, the true hero that day had been my grandfather, but protocols didn't allow decorations for civilians, even legendary former police officers. Thomas Reed, however, seemed perfectly content to remain in the shadows, watching with quiet pride as I was feted as the officer who prevented a terrorist attack. "Don't be silly, Alex," he told me when I expressed my discomfort at taking all the credit. "The medal is rightfully yours. You made the right decision at the right time. I just pointed you in the right direction." It was typical of him to downplay his own contributions while extolling those of others, especially mine. From a young age, whenever I showed the slightest sign of aptitude for something, my grandfather was the first to celebrate, often exaggerating my achievements to anyone who would listen. The airport routine changed significantly after the incident. New protocols were implemented, training on identifying suspicious behavior was intensified, and I was promoted to security supervisor with the additional responsibility of training new agents. In one of these training sessions, 3 months after the incident, I used our experience as an example. What happened at Gate 17 that April morning teaches us a fundamental lesson. I explained to the group of new recruits, technology is an invaluable tool, but it will never replace human observation and intuition developed through years of experience. One of the recruits, too young to look comfortable in his still starched uniform, raised his hand. "But, Officer Reed, how can we develop this intuition? It's not something that can be taught in manuals." I smiled, thinking exactly what my grandfather would say: constant observation, tireless curiosity, and the humility to learn from every person you meet, especially those who have more experience than you. That night, I called my grandfather in Chicago, where he was still, having extended his stay to spend more time with his family after my cousin's wedding. "How's the newbie training going?" he asked after the usual greetings. "Well, they're smart, enthusiastic, and completely dependent on technology." He laughed, that deep laugh that seemed to come from deep within his chest. "Just like you, before that day." "It wasn't that bad," I protested lamely. "Alex, could you identify a suspect without going through a body scanner?" "Of course," I replied, indignant. "And that's what I made you do that day, isn't it? I dared you to look beyond the monitors." I remained silent, recognizing the truth in his words. "You know what intrigues me most about that day?" I continued, subtly changing the subject. "The timing, the boarding bridge locking up just as Khalid was planning to board. If that hadn't happened, if boarding had gone smoothly, he would have shipped the bomb. And hundreds of people would have died," my grandfather added, his voice now somber. "Sometimes, Alex, the universe conspires in our favor. Call it luck, destiny, or divine intervention. The important thing is to be prepared to recognize and seize these opportunities when they arise." That conversation stayed with me for days as I tried to reconcile the pragmatic view of a police officer with the almost mystical perspective my grandfather offered. It was interrupted, however, by an unexpected development in the case. On a rainy July morning, I was summoned to the airport security director's office. There, I found not only my direct supervisor, but also 2 FBI agents I recognized from the initial investigation. "Reed," my director began, "without preamble, we have news on the Khalid case." One of the FBI aides, a middle-aged woman with a severe haircut and eyes that seemed to record every movement in the room, opened a folder and pushed a photograph toward me. "Do you recognize this man?" The photo showed a Caucasian man around 50, with close-cropped gray hair, wearing an airport maintenance uniform. Something about him struck me as vaguely familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. It should. This is Viktor Petrov. He's been a maintenance technician at this airport for 4 years. Immigrated from Russia in 2016, obtained U.S. citizenship in 2020. Okay, and why are we talking about him? The male agent, who had remained silent until then, leaned forward. "Because he disappeared the day after the incident with Khalid, and because we found evidence that he was the one who sabotaged the boarding bridge." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Sabotage? Wait, that doesn't make sense. If he sabotaged the bridge, he would have prevented Khalid from boarding the bomb. Why would an accomplice do that? The agent smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's the thing, Reed. He wasn't an accomplice. He was competition. Over the next few weeks, I was drawn into an investigation far larger and more complex than I could have imagined. The story that emerged from the evidence, interrogations, and declassified documents was almost unbelievable. Viktor Petrov, whose real name was Vitaly Petrovsky, was a sleeper agent for the FSB, the Russian intelligence service. He had been placed at Boston Airport as part of a long-term operation to monitor the movements of American military officials and diplomats who frequently used the hub for international travel. At the same time, Ashraf Khalid, although genuinely motivated by religious extremism, had been manipulated by Iranian intelligence cells, which provided him with the explosives and training necessary for the attack. What no one expected, not the Iranians, not the Russians, much less the American intelligence agents, was that two hostile operations would collide on the same flight, on the same day. Petrov found out about the bomb, the FBI agent explained during one of our meetings, probably through the surveillance he was keeping on the terminal. He couldn't allow the bombing to happen. Why? Since when do Russian agents care about American lives? I asked skeptically. They don't care, the female agent replied dryly. But on that flight were two dissident Russian scientists traveling under false identities en route to a witness protection program. The FSB wanted them alive for extraction and interrogation, not blown up at 30,000 feet. It was like watching a chess match where I could only see half the board. Each new piece of information revealed another layer of complexity, another layer of manipulation and counter-manipulation among intelligence agents operating in the shadows. So Petrov sabotaged the bridge to prevent the bomb from boarding, he concludes. Exactly. And then he fled, probably with the dissident. Once he realized the plan had been exposed and airport security had been tightened. When I reported these findings to my grandfather on our next call, he was silent for so long that I thought the connection had dropped. Grandpa? Are you still there? I am, Alex, he finally replied, his voice strangely distant. I'm just processing all of this. It's a lot to process, I agree. Another long silence followed until he finally asked, and how are you dealing with all this? I pondered the question. How did I feel, knowing I had been merely a pawn in a much larger game? That what I interpreted as my grandfather's police intuition and my own quick response had actually been manipulated by forces I barely understood? Honestly, I feel a little like everything I did that day wasn't really mine. Don't say that, my grandfather scolded, his voice regaining its familiar firmness. You did, confronting Khalid, evacuating the terminal, coordinating the emergency response. All of that was yours. Your decisions, your courage, your training and action. But if Petrov hadn't sabotaged the bridge, if we don't live in a world of ifs, Alec. We live in a world of hard facts. And the fact is, regardless of the behind-the-scenes manipulation, you saved lives that day. Never forget that. Her words comforted me, but they didn't completely dispel the feeling of having been manipulated. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my work, determined to improve the airport's security protocols so that no Viktor Petrov could ever again operate with impunity on our premises. My grandfather returned to Boston at the end of July, declining my offer to pick him up at the airport. I'd rather go through your section like a regular passenger, he insisted. I want to see if your new protocols work. I smiled, imagining him deliberately acting suspiciously to test my team. Don't cause trouble, Grandpa. My agents are authorized to detain suspicious passengers. Perfect, he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. It will be a good test. On the day of their arrival, I purposely stayed away from the terminal, allowing my newly trained team to handle the procedures without my direct supervision. When my radio crackled with a call to report to the main control station, I couldn't help but smile. Reed, I answered, trying to sound professional. Chief, we have a situation at Control 4. An elderly gentleman is causing problems. Let me guess. Tall, white hair, probably asking too many questions about our equipment? A moment of confused silence on the other end. No, boss. It's an Asian gentleman. He's complaining about the treatment he received during the inspection. I frowned, disappointed that it wasn't my grandfather acting up, but immediately in professional mode. I am on my way. After resolving the situation, misunderstanding involving a souvenir that looked suspicious on the scanner but was perfectly harmless, returned to my office to find my grandfather comfortably ensconced in my chair, leafing through some of the training manuals on my desk. "How did you get in here?" I asked, genuinely surprised. He smiled, that smile of someone who just proved a point. "Your new protocols are good, Alec. Your agents are attentive, efficient. They double-checked my credentials, asked all the right questions, but they still rely heavily on technology." The young man at Station 3 checked my identification in the system, and when he confirmed that I was indeed Thomas Reed, Supervisor Reed's grandfather, he automatically let his guard down. I crossed my arms, feeling a mixture of pride that he was still so perceptive and irritation that he had found flaws in my protocols. "And how do you suggest we resolve this?" He stood up, giving me my chair. "Technology and protocols are tools, Alice, not substitutes for critical thinking. You need to train your agents to question everything, even what seems perfectly normal. Especially what seems perfectly normal." His words reminded me of the day of the incident, of how Khalid had tried to blend in with the crowd of angry passengers, of how only his subtly out-of-place nervousness had given him away. "Question everything," I repeated, nodding slowly. "Even when all the systems say everything is fine. Especially then, my grandfather. Possibility that there might not be any scientists at all?" I raised my eyebrows. "What do you mean?" The FBI confirmed, The FBI confirmed what its intelligence sources reported. But what if the intelligence was wrong, or deliberately manipulated? "Are you suggesting that Petrov had another motive for sabotaging the bridge?" He shrugged, that characteristic gesture that meant I'm just speculating. "But think about it. I'm suggesting that in espionage game, we rarely know the whole truth. Sometimes, even the players don't know all the rules." That conversation planted a seed of doubt in my mind that refused to go away. In the following weeks, with the discreet collaboration of one of the FBI agents with whom I had developed a trust during the investigation, I began digging deeper into the case. What we discovered was even more disturbing than the official narrative. There were no dissident scientists on Flight 3715. This information had been planted in American intelligence channels by the Russians themselves as part of a disinformation operation. Petrov's true target for protection was far more valuable: a flash drive containing information about Russian covert operations on American soil, which was being transported by a seemingly ordinary Carrera University professor returning to Chicago after a conference. When I confronted my grandfather with this information, his reaction surprised me. Instead of surprise or curiosity, he simply nodded, as if he thinks he might be in Eastern Europe, maybe back in Russia. "What about the dissident scientists? There's no sign of them either. It's as if they've evaporated." My grandfather chewed thoughtfully on a piece of bread. "Have you ever considered the new? Or at least suspected? Why don't you look surprised?" I asked, puzzled. He hesitated, a rare thing for Thomas Reed, who usually had quick answers for everything. "Alex, there are things about my career I've never told you." "What kind of things?" He sighed deeply, suddenly looking all of his 82 years. In the 1970s and early 1980s, before becoming police chief in Portland, I worked on a joint task force with the FBI, specializing in domestic counterintelligence. I felt my jaw drop. You were an FBI agent?" Unofficially, I was what they called a local asset, a regular cop with additional training, who served as the Bureau's eyes and ears in areas where they needed discreet coverage. "And why did you never tell me this?" "Because it was classified, Alex. It still is, technically. But considering recent events and the fact that the Cold War officially ended decades ago..." Wait, I interrupted, my mind racing to connect the dots. "You knew about Petrov? About the Russian operation?" He shook his head. "Not specifically. My active days were over long before Petrov even considered coming to the United States. But I know the patterns, the methods. When I saw that maintenance man near the jetway, something felt... familiar." "Did you see Petrov? On the day of the incident?" "Briefly. He was adjusting something on the bridge moments before it locked. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Only later, when everything happened, did the pieces start to fall into place. My world was spinning. The grandfather I'd known all my life, the hard-nosed cop, the storyteller, the man who taught me to fish and shoot, was suddenly revealing a whole new dimension to his existence. That's why you were so attentive to Khalid. It wasn't just ordinary police intuition. He smiled, but it was a sad smile, heavy with memory. It was intuition, Alec, just shaped by experiences you didn't know about. And when I said, stand down in the briefing, I had just seen Petrov messing with the bridge. Something told me there was going to be a problem, and I wanted you to be prepared to react, not stuck to your monitors and procedures. I remained silent, trying to take it all in. Part of me was hurt that he had kept such a significant secret for so long. Another part understood perfectly the weight of confidentiality, especially in matters of national security, was not something I could ignore, being a federal agent myself. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked. My grandfather reached across the table and took mine, his wrinkled fingers surprisingly strong. "Because you deserve to know, and because I want you to understand something fundamental about the work we do, whether as local police officers, federal agents, or intelligence operatives, that we never see the whole picture, Alec. Never. We believe we're protecting people, following protocols, upholding the law, and we are. But we're also pieces in bigger games that we don't always understand." His words resonated deeply, echoing the doubts I myself had harbored since the revelations about Petrov. And so what do we do? Just accept that we are being manipulated? He squeezed my hand tighter. "No, we do what you did that day. We observe, we question, we trust our training and our instinct. And above all, we never forget who we really fight for, the ordinary people whose lives depend on our decisions." That conversation marked a turning point in my career. In the months that followed, I implemented significant changes to airport security protocols, focusing less on rigid checklists and more on behavioral observation training. I invited my grandfather to lead some training sessions where he shared his decades of experience, though, of course, omitting his FBI connection. The Khalid Petrov affair eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by new crises and threats, but its effects on my personal and professional life continued to reverberate. In October, 6 months after the incident, I received an unexpected call. It was Marcus Bennett, the FBI agent he had worked with on the investigation. "Reed, we have a situation in DC that could benefit from your expertise. Are you interested in a temporary assignment?" That's how I found myself in Washington, working on a special task force focused on identifying potential foreign actors operating within critical American infrastructure. The work was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure, discovering how many vulnerabilities existed and how many threats went undetected every day. One afternoon, while I was reviewing suspicious activity reports at various airports around the country, Bennett walked into my temporary office with a grave expression. "We just received this," he said, placing a folder on my desk. "We thought you should see it." Inside the folder was a single photograph. Viktor Petrov, or whoever he really was, sitting in a cafe in Prague. The photo had been taken 3 days earlier. "He's resurfaced," I commented, studying the image. Petrov looked relaxed, sipping from a cup while reading a newspaper. Nothing in his posture suggested a man on the run. "Yes, and that's not all." Bennett pulled another document from the folder, a transcript of communications intercepts. Most of it was in Russian, with English translations in the margins. Our team in Prague intercepted a conversation between Petrov and his handler in Moscow. "They are discussing the Boston incident as a success." "Success?" I repeated, confused. "But their operation was exposed. Petrov had to How can that be considered a success?" Bennett sat in the chair across from me, his face grim. "Because it appears the goal was never to protect Russian intelligence or agents. The goal was exactly what happened: to expose an Iranian terrorist cell operating on American soil, increase tension between the US and Iran, and at the same time position Russia as an ally against terrorism." I felt a chill down my spine. "Are you telling me the Russians knew about Khalid all along? That they could have simply alerted our agency, but chose this elaborate method of sabotage?" "It seems so. If they had warned directly, they would have had to reveal their sources, their methods. This way, they got what they wanted without compromising their operations." "What about the lives at risk? The people on that plane?" Bennett shrugged. a gesture that reminded me painfully of my grandfather. Acceptable collateral damage in their view. If something went wrong, they wouldn't be held responsible. If it went well, as it did, they could use it as a bargaining chip in future diplomatic negotiations. I remained silent, absorbing the implication. My participation in all of this, my moment of heroism, had been carefully orchestrated as part of a geopolitical game I barely understood. Why are you showing me this? It's classified, isn't it? Bennett hesitated. Technically, yes, but I thought you deserved to know. And, there's one more thing. He removed one last document from the folder. This one thinner than the others. We found this while investigating Petrov's past. A 1983 photo from an academic symposium in East Berlin. The photo showed a group of men in suits, all with serious expressions characteristic of the Cold War. In the right corner was a young man who was clearly Petrov, perhaps in his early 20s, but it was another figure in the photo that captured my attention, an American in his 40s, identified in the caption as FBI delegation, academic contacts, my grandfather. What does this mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We don't know for sure, Bennett admitted. His grandfather participated in several counterintelligence operations during the Cold War, some of which are still classified. This symposium was a cover for backroom negotiations. It's possible they met back then? Are you suggesting that my grandfather and Petrov worked together? That they might have been coordinating during the Boston incident? Bennett raised his hands in a defensive gesture. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just sharing information I thought you should know. What you do with it is your decision. After he left, I sat for hours contemplating the photo. The idea that my grandfather might have been involved on a deeper level than he'd admitted was disturbing, but not entirely implausible. He himself had said that we never see the whole picture. That night, I called him. Grandpa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. I always am, he replied, but there was a note of caution in his voice. Did you know Viktor Petrov before the airport incident? The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. Where did you find that name? He finally asked, his voice controlled. Answer my question, please. Another long silence. Not as Viktor Petrov, he finally replied. In my time, he went by another name, Vitaly Kuznetsov. I felt my heart race. So you recognized him at the airport? Try. And you didn't tell me. I couldn't, Alex. Some things remain classified. Even decades later, I took a deep breath, trying to control the mix of emotions, anger, confusion, betrayal. You worked together during the Cold War? Were you what? Double agents? My grandfather laughed, but it was a humorless laugh, nothing so dramatic. Kuznetsov was a contact what we called a cooperative source. He provided information about Soviet operations in exchange for certain consideration. What kind of consideration? The kind that allowed him to eventually build a new life in the US, apparently. I tried to process this revelation, and when he saw him at the airport, I was as surprised as you would be. I hadn't seen him in over 30 years, Alex. Thought he was dead, or at least long retired to Russia. Why would he sabotage the bridge? Why? Would he risk himself like that? My grandfather sighed heavily. I can only speculate. Maybe one last mission before retirement. Maybe a settling of scores with former employers. Or maybe maybe he really wanted to stop a terrorist attack. Even old spies have a conscience, occasionally. Did you talk to him? That day? Briefly. He recognized me too, of course. He just said, Thomas, watch out for the nervous man's briefcase. That was enough to alert me. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it through the phone. And then you warned me, in your own way? Exactly. I couldn't say it explicitly, not in that environment, not with so many cameras and witnesses, but I knew you'd understand, eventually. We were silent for a moment, each of us absorbing the implications of these revelations. Do you know where he is now? I asked finally. No, and it's better this way for all of us. After that conversation, I had to reevaluate not just the airport incident, but my entire understanding of my grandfather's career, of my own role as a federal agent, of the unseen forces that shaped events we considered mere coincidences. My time in Washington lasted 6 months, during which I worked on several cases related to security threats to critical infrastructure. The knowledge I gained during this time was valuable, but also disturbing. The extent of the vulnerabilities, the complexity of the threats, and the frequency with which foreign intelligence operations were taking place right under our noses. When I finally returned to Boston, I brought with me a complete transformed perspective on my work. I no longer saw the airport as just a transit point for passengers, but as a node in a vast web of competing interests, a stage where world powers played out secret dramas daily. My grandfather and I never again discussed Petrov or his FBI past directly. It was as if we had made a tacit agreement to leave that chapter behind. However, our conversations about work took on a new dimension with veiled references and implicit lessons about the behind-the-scenes workings of the world of security and intelligence. In one such conversation, over Thanksgiving dinner a year after the incident, he asked me about my new airport security protocols. Have you implemented those changes we discussed? Less technology? More human observation? I nodded, pouring us more of the wine he'd brought, a surprisingly sophisticated Cabernet for someone who normally preferred beer. Yes, I've reorganized the teams so we always have dedicated observers, people whose sole job is to monitor behavior, not luggage or documents. And we've already identified 3 passengers attempting to smuggle drugs, 1 attempting to transport protected wildlife specimen, and a foreign diplomat carrying undeclared document. He smiled, that proud smile that always warmed my heart, no matter how old I was. See, people always tell stories with their bodies, even when their mouths lie. I took a sip of the wine, enjoying its complex flavor. There's something I've always wanted to ask you, he said, hesitant. About that day, what? When you told me to stand down, was it really because you wanted me to observe people better? Or was there something more specific you were trying to tell me? My grandfather considered the question for a moment, swirling the wine in his glass. Both, he finally replied. I wanted you to observe better, yes, but also, there was something in the air that day, Alex. A tension I recognized from my earlier days, like one predator recognizes another, even from a distance. Did you feel something was going to happen before you even saw Khalid or Petrov? Let's just say that when you spend enough time in conflict zones, whether on the streets as a police officer or in more specialized operations, you develop a 6th sense for imminent danger. I nodded, understanding. I'd experienced something similar. Myself, moments when a chill on the back of my neck or an unexplained uneasiness alerted me to trouble seconds before it manifested. And when you told me to back off, I was trying to give you space to feel what I was feeling, to look beyond the procedures and connect with that primal instinct we all carry, but that modern society trains us to ignore. Reflecting on that day, I realized he was right. In the moments after his warning, after his stand down, I had indeed begun to notice nuances I'd previously ignored: Khalid's misplaced nervousness, the unusual movement near the jetway, the charged atmosphere that preceded the chaos. You know what's most ironic about all this? I asked, refilling our glasses. What? That after everything, the investigation, the revelations about Petrov, about his connection to him, about the Russian and Iranian manipulations after all of that, what really saved those people was something as simple and straightforward as an experienced officer recognizing suspicious behavior. My grandfather smiled, raising his glass in a toast. To simplicity in a complicated world. To simplicity, I agreed, clinking my glass to his. The following spring, almost 2 years after the airport incident, I received an anonymous letter at my apartment, a manila envelope with no return address, containing only a Russian newspaper clipping and a white card with a handwritten message. The clipping reported the death of a prominent Russian citizen in a car accident in Moscow. There was no photo, just a name I immediately recognized: Vitaly Petrovsky. The card contained only 3 words, written in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Thank you. Stand down. I never found out who sent that letter. It could have been Petrov himself before his death if he was truly dead. It could have been someone from the FBI or some other intelligence agent. It could even have been my grandfather, though he vehemently denied it when I questioned him. What mattered, I realized, was not the source of the message, but its meaning. Stand down, retreat, observe, evaluate. The words my grandfather used that day at the airport had become a mantra for me, a constant reminder that in a world where technology and protocols dominated, the human factor, intuition, experience, the primal instinct for danger, remained our most valuable tool. A few months later, I was promoted to Director of Security at Logan Airport, the youngest person ever to hold the position. In my inauguration speech, with my grandfather sitting proudly in the front row, I shared a lesson I had learned the hard way. Safety isn't about sophisticated equipment or rigid procedures, though both are important. True safety lies in human attentiveness, in the ability to observe, question, and, when necessary, act decisively even when all systems say everything is fine, because sometimes the greatest danger lies precisely in what seems all too normal. That lesson, the lesson my grandfather tried to teach me that April morning with his stand down, moments before the jetway locked and I led the crowd away from imminent danger, became the guiding principle not just of my career, but of my life. In an increasingly automated world, where algorithms and protocols attempt to replace human judgment, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is step back, observe, and trust our primal instincts. Because while machines can process data, only humans can sense the imperceptible chill of danger in the air, that sixth sense that kept us alive as a species for thousands of years before the first security camera was invented. This is the lesson I carry with me every day, in every briefing, in every critical decision. The lesson I now pass on to my own agents and which, I hope, I will one day pass on to my children and grandchildren, just as my grandfather passed it on to me. Stand down, observe, trust your instincts, and then, when the moment demands it, act without hesitation. Because sometimes, that moment between observing and acting is all that separates tragedy from salvation. As I discovered that morning at the airport, when my grandfather said stand down at the briefing, moments before the boarding bridge locked and I led the crowd away from danger. 5 years after the Logan Airport incident, my life had taken a turn I never imagined. As Director of Security, I implemented significant changes in protocols that became a model for other airports across the country. My training program, focused on behavioral observation, was adopted by the TSA as part of its standard curriculum. I was invited to speak at international conferences on critical infrastructure security. But none of these professional achievements compared to what I consider my greatest legacy, the Reed Security Mentoring Program, an initiative I created to connect experienced, near-retiring agents with newly hired rookies, creating a tacit knowledge transfer pipeline that no manual or simulation could replicate. The name, of course, was a tribute to my grandfather, who sadly didn't live to see the program implemented. Thomas Reed passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years after the incident. At the age of 85, I found among his belongings a diary detailing some of his experiences during the Cold War, experiences that further reinforced my conviction that the intuition developed over decades of service was a treasure we couldn't afford to lose when veterans hung up their badges. On a particularly busy autumn afternoon, I was conducting a routine inspection in Terminal E when my assistant urgently intercepted me. Director Reed, we have a situation in the international section. An unscheduled diplomatic delegation has just arrived. They are demanding immediate passage without security screen. Based on what? I asked, already heading towards the place. Diplomatic immunity. They say they are carrying confidential documents to the embassy. Have you checked? The credentials? Yes, ma'am. They seem to be in order, but something doesn't seem right. Like this? It's hard to explain. Just ... a feeling. One of the diplomats seems extremely nervous, sweating heavily despite the air conditioning. I smiled, pleased to see the fruits of my training. Trust that feeling. I'm on my way. Upon arriving at the international checkpoint, I found a tense scene. 4 men in impeccable, 3 of them with the rigid posture characteristic of security guards, the 4th a middle-aged man with neatly trimmed gray hair, clearly leading the group. They displayed diplomatic credentials from the Russian embassy and carried identical black briefcases handcuffed to their wrists. Good morning, gentlemen, I greeted in Russian, a skill I had acquired in recent years precisely for situations like this. I'm Alexandra, Director of Security. The leader looked momentarily surprised that I spoke his language, but soon composed himself. There's a misunderstanding here. We are official representatives of the Russian Federation carrying diplomatic documents. We are granted immunity from inspection under the Vienna Convention. I understand perfectly, sir. Volkov. Mikhail Volkov, political advisor. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral as I subtly scanned the group. 3 of them maintained the composure expected of seasoned diplomatic officials. The 4th, a younger man, perhaps in his 30s, exhibited exactly the signs my assistant had mentioned: excessive sweating, an erratic gaze, fingers nervously drumming the briefcase strapped to his wrist. Counselor Volkov, I am aware of diplomatic privileges. However, these privileges do not override our aviation security protocols, particularly when it comes to unannounced delegations. Our arrival was communicated through the appropriate channels, he insisted. If there was a miscommunication, that's your department's problem, not ours. I maintained my professional smile, but my mind was racing. There was no record of a Russian diplomatic delegation scheduled for that day. I personally checked the VIP list every morning. Naturally, we will look into this immediately. In the meantime, we would be honored to escort you to our VIP lounge where you can wait in comfort. It was a standard offer to buy time, but also a test. Legitimate diplomats with tight schedules would usually protest but accept the hospitality. People with something to hide often became nervous about any delay. Volkov exchanged quick glances with his companion. I'm afraid this is unacceptable. We have a flight to Washington in 40 minutes. Any delay would jeopardize a crucial meeting at the embassy. Absent understandingly, I completely understand. In that case, we will expedite the process. If you could present your diplomatic passports and boarding documents, double quotes. While my agents reviewed the documents presented, I made polite conversation with Volkov, discreetly observing the nervous man, who now seemed even more agitated. Is this your first time in Boston, counselor? No, I've been here several times. Fascinating city, although I prefer New York. And your colleagues? Also experienced diplomats. Except for Dmitri. It's his first international mission. The nervous young man, Dmitri, tried to smile at being mentioned, but the result was more of a grimace. One of my agents approached discreetly. Director, the passports look authentic, but the system shows the Volkov was in Moscow for only 36 hours. It's physically impossible for him to have attended the conference in Vancouver that he mentions as the reason for his trip. I kept my expression unchanged, but mentally an alarm rang. Something was definitely wrong. Counselor, it seems we still have some discrepancies to resolve. If you would, please accompany me to the administration room. Double quotes. I already told you we don't have time for this, Volkov interrupted, his voice now carrying a hint of irritation. It's a clear violation of diplomatic protocol. It was at that moment that I noticed a movement almost imperceptible, but one that my years of training immediately registered. Dmitri, the nervous one, had subtly adjusted his position so that his briefcase was partially hidden behind his body, out of my line of sight. In an instant, several pieces fell into place in my mind. The unannounced arrival, the discrepancies in the document, Dmitri's excessive nervousness, his insistence on avoiding any kind of waiting or additional verification. My left hand discreetly activated the silent alert button on my communicator, a code that would mobilize our tactical team without any visible alarms. With my right hand, I made a gesture that seemed casual, but which my agents would recognize as an instruction to position themselves strategically. Counselor Volkov, just one more question if I may. What hotel did you stay at in Vancouver? It was a trick. Question. If they had indeed come from a conference in Vancouver as they claimed, the answer would have been immediate. The hesitation, even brief, would have been revealing. Volkov frowned for a microsecond before answering. 4 seasons. Excellent establishment. I nodded as if accepting his answer, while noting 2 crucial details. First, the diplomatic conference he'd mentioned had been held at the Fairmont, not the Four Seasons. Second, during his brief hesitation, Dmitri had exchanged alarmed glances with another member of the group. Well, everything seems to be in order, he said, his tone deliberately relaxed. Just one last protocol detail. We need to record the serial numbers of the diplomatic bags. Standard procedure for secure correspondence. There was no such procedure, of course. It was another test. This is unacceptable, Volkov replied immediately. The contents of these briefcases are protected by the Vienna Convention. Not even the serial numbers can be recorded. I smiled, now certain of my suspicions. In fact, Counselor, external serial numbers are routinely recorded, precisely because they do not compromise protected content. All legitimate diplomats know this. Volkov's face hardened, realizing he had been caught in a trap. This is an outrage. I demand to speak to your superior immediately. At that moment, I noticed a subtle movement. Dmitri slowly moving his free hand towards the inside pocket of his jacket. "Stand down," I yelled, instantly reverting to emergency protocol. My officers, already strategically positioned, responded immediately. Within seconds, the 4 men were pinned to the ground, while a tactical team quickly converged on the area. Subsequent inspection revealed that none of them were diplomats. The credentials were sophisticated forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. The briefcases contained advanced electronic devices, later identified as espionage equipment intended to compromise computer systems at the U.S. Embassy in Washington. Dmitri was armed with a compact polymer pistol, specially designed to avoid detection on conventional scanners. Exactly the kind of threat my behavioral observation program aimed to identify when technology failed. Hours later, after preliminary interrogations and the transfer of the suspects to federal custody, I received a call from the Director of National Intelligence. "Director, congratulations on today's intercept. You've just stopped what could have been one of the most significant espionage operations on American soil in the last decade." "Just doing my job." "Sir, you're just doing the job saved critical national security information. The delegation that intercepted it was carrying equipment that could have compromised communications systems across the East Coast." After the call, I sat in my office, contemplating the day's events. What had first alerted me wasn't the inconsistent document, nor even the unannounced arrival. It was human behavior, the out-of-place nervousness, the exchanged glances, the micro-expressions of alarm when pressed, just like my grandfather had taught me years ago. That night, when I got home, I lit a candle in front of the photograph of Thomas Reed I kept on my bookshelf. It wasn't a religious practice, just my little personal ritual for moments when I felt his presence most strongly. "I got it, Grandpa," I murmured to the photograph. "Stand down, observe, trust your instinct, and then act without hesitation." I could have sworn that, for a moment, I saw his proud smile shine brighter in the photograph. Perhaps it was just a trick of the candlelight. Or perhaps, as he always said, there were forces in the universe that our science and technology couldn't yet fully explain.